Hello! Our story begins in the year 254 BBY, at the peak of a mountain within the Mid-Rim. At the Sanctuary Mount, masters of the High Council gathered. The system was Quen, and Master Opa Rancisis was considering the potential of opening up a Jedi outpost overlooking the Gem Cities. The Council had agreed to join him on this expedition. This was a time of great peace, of technological advancement, societal brilliance, and balance in the Force. The Jedi Order was centuries removed from true conflict, and instilling law and order to those across the cosmos. Relations with the populace and the Jedi had never been better, and with the Council gathered on Quen, they were considering more expansion. The era of the High Republic had been one of growth, especially for the Order. They were now planting themselves across the galaxy, and here at Quen, just a short jump away from Hutt space, the Jedi were establishing more control. It had become a mandate of the Order since the fall of the Sith to maintain a firm connection with the Republic, and therefore a strong relationship with the people it protected. Much had changed since the Age of War, and the system the Order cooperated with no longer held a strong military force. The Republic was a prosperous system, without any need for militaristic involvement. Their strength was in the potential they had as a society. There were, of course, the distinct sections of the galaxy, but they weren't divided, nor seen as greater or lesser people. The core was just as connected to the Inner Rim, as was the Inner Rim to the Mid-Rim. There were whispers within the Galactic Senate of Republic expansion into the Outer Rim, something the Jedi had become privy to. They wished to be of an assistance to this, only if it could be done right. Here at Quen was where their methods were being continuously proposed. Outposts for learning could be centers of not just Jedi advancement but societal. The discussions passed around these masters led to a proposal from one of the many elders. Yoda perched himself on a stone. He smiled, looking down over the valley. Life had been kind to him. Those around him and across the Order saw him as the wisest of their Order. But just because he was the eldest among them didn't mean he didn't have more to learn. These standing beliefs encouraged many Jedi to want to be like their Grand Master. He was one of 3 at this current point in galactic history. Yoda's hands were rested on his knees, as he listened to his peers discuss potential routes going forward, especially with Quen. He loved the talk, but he was so enamored with the Gem Cities. They were beautiful, untouched by conflict, unlike many places the Grand Master had seen within his lifetime. The voice of a longtime ally, LaRue, cut through the air. Yoda turned on a swivel, still smiling softly, asking his friend what it was. He hadn't heard him. A small chuckle resonated with the others in the group, knowing that Yoda was lost in the beauty of this world. The other Grand Master expressed that the counselors had come up with an idea. Yoda nodded, wishing to hear it as his beaming grin moved to various faces with him. One of their newest members, Yariel Poof, stepped forward. He could be seen, being that he was the tallest amongst his peers, but he got before Yoda and bowed, expressing that in such a golden age, the Jedi should propose more influence over the system they were so loyal to. Yoda was confused with the proposed direction, so he asked that Yariel elaborate. The new counselor explained that in this age, the Jedi and the Republic were tighter than ever before. The relationship shared between these sects had been high for generations, and he simply thought that the best way to maintain the positive relationship was through integration. Of course, not suggesting that the Jedi Order become the Republic, but perhaps political representation wasn't far-fetched. After all, if his history lessons were correct, the Order and the government had served together through some of the most painful eras in galactic history. If they could overcome the darkness of the Sith together, then why not merge their interests at this juncture, so that whenever darkness inevitably returns, they could squash it with relative ease? Yoda thought quietly for a moment. It wasn't the worst idea. As of now, many of the Jedi within the Order believed Yoda was the chosen one. It was an unspoken ideal, and Yariel Poof, being one of the many Jedi to believe this, thought that Yoda could merge the Republic and the Jedi to prevent shifts in the Force from finding completion. These superstitions with the Grand Master's placement with the prophecy wasn't ill-intended. At this point in their history, he had one of the highest M counts on record, and under his leadership, he had maintained unprecedented peace. Though, as the thought of a merge sat on Yoda's mind, Yariel spoke once more, suggesting that he was proposing a move for the role of Chancellor. Lifetime seats within the Senate weren't common, same could be said with the role of Chancellor, but he thought about the positive impact this could have for the Jedi. If they could tighten their relationship with the system that helped them with so much, then they could continue being effective. Yoda stood up and slid off the rock as he pressed his hands together, considering this. At his current age, he wasn't walking with a cane yet, still quite loose in his opinion. He looked up at the Masters of the Council, asking if they too were in agreement with this proposal. They nodded their heads, seeing it as beneficial for all parties involved. They could effectively tie together their institutions for the betterment of the galaxy, and say if conflict did arise, then the Jedi would have the full backing of the Republic. Yoda considered the implications of this, because they could have extraordinarily negative effects, which is what he first feared when the idea was passed. If something went wrong, then the Jedi could be held accountable, even if it was out of their control, and that was the point the Counselors came to as well. At this current moment, there had been stirrings regarding a failure in the North Mid-Rim, and the Senate was considering blaming the Jedi for it. While there were a couple knights present for the incident, they had de-escalated the situation, so the senators moving against the Jedi weren't going to get anywhere. But Master Rancisis cut in. If this type of behavior continued for, say, a decade, the entire perspective of the Order could be skewed by flawed politicians. Yoda feared potentially becoming that. If the Jedi were too flawed politicians, then their mandate to the people would become skewed. Their connection to the Force could be lost in deliberations on tax codes or trade gobbledygook. The Council agreed, which is why they wished to float the idea to him. Yoda held great reservation about doing something like this, because it could go wrong for them in so many ways. But a lingering conversation that hadn't been resolved in years was the question of what would happen if the Jedi were betrayed by the Senate. More than anything, it was just a question, so it wasn't super deep, but still, in such a scenario, what would they do? When they returned to Coruscant after designating Rancisis with the construction of the Jedi outpost on Quen, Yoda pondered the questions posed to him. This was a time of unprecedented peace. There were no threats to the Republic. The Jedi were regarded higher now than they were after they liberated Coruscant. If there was any time to stand with the Republic as a representative, then it was now. Seize the popularity of the Jedi and maintain it through strong economic growth, with policies that align with the current direction of the public. As Grand Master, Yoda was perhaps more educated than anyone on the policies of the current administration. He knew where they would lead, and how it would continue to affect the galaxy. If he was simply placed into that realm, he could maintain the status quo, and that would be more than enough to simply get by. The Grand Master meditated on the potential of actually doing this. It slowly became more and more favorable in his mind. Since the Old Republic and the recapture of Coruscant, the Republic had vowed to fund Jedi business. This allowed the Order to act openly with an annual budget provided by the government. It was how the Jedi always had credits ready to go without making any money directly. This is because the Jedi would act in favor of the Republic, regardless of the time it was, whether it was war or not. So to the Grand Master, if they could perhaps control said budget, they could also maintain a steady flow of credits to the Order, giving them the ability to act more openly. In the past few centuries, their budget had decreased. It wasn't horrible loss, but it was a noticeable difference. The Jedi did a ton of humanitarian work in the galaxy, and a lot of it was possible thanks to their funding. Yoda promised to himself and eventually to the Council that if they went down this path, they could not allow greed to overstep their mandate to the people. The system took great politicians and spat them out as bureaucrats. It wasn't especially common at this point in history, but it was trending towards more corruption. The Jedi Council and their Grand Master agreed that they would move into the Senate and attempt a play for the role of Chancellor. They'd have to wait until the current administration ended to put their names in. Typically, an individual would have to be a member of the Senate, but it wasn't impossible for others to put their name in. Yoda's involvement was a surprise to many, because people hadn't viewed the Jedi as a political body, rather just a community of knights. And because Yoda was so well known in the public eye, and respected as the eldest member of the Jedi Order and their leader, he was able to surprisingly beat the competition inside the Senate. In his place, the Jedi Order would add a 14th seat to the High Council. At this period, there were 3 Grand Masters, and this extra seat would be awarded to an individual who would neglect political biases and judge Yoda's administration openly. Essentially, it was a means to ensure the Jedi didn't get a bad rap, and thanks to Yoda's extensive knowledge on the political world of the Republic, he brought in members to fill his cabinet from an array of outside sources. This didn't mean individuals that were unprepared or uneducated. These were individuals that knew their stuff, and worked really well with the Jedi Order as well. There was some fear about the Jedi taking political office, but those fears were put to rest immediately. Yoda's administration was quiet. There were no loud pressers, bills, or executive orders that caused uproars, or anything else. He simply maintained the status quo, while also expanding Republic territory. What became a problem for the Jedi were the views they received from the public. Policy making wasn't like being a knight of the Republic. It directly affected people's lives, and for the most part, no one disliked the Jedi yet. It was very rare to find someone who openly hated them, because they had done so much positivity in the galaxy. But putting themselves into politics was directly placing them in the line of fire, if something went wrong. Good thing is, it didn't. There were a number of deals made during this time, including some expansion movements. This helped the Republic locate violent marauders forming in the Outer Rim. Initially, there were some rejections of the expansion unit that Yoda was starting, but once it slowly became apparent that there were enemies lurking in the Outer Rim, the Chancellor's move looked rightly made. It was a weird thing politically. Yoda was trying to expand Republic territory, because the Jedi had been trying to do that for centuries. Now they were aware of growing resentment, and in an effort to quell the flames, they could counter it. Because the Nihil movement hadn't started yet, there was no reason to totally freak out. But Yoda suggested that a small military be formed for the Republic, a defense force that could aid the Jedi militaristically if their humanitarian work went awry. The next few years of Yoda's 2 administrations would be relatively sound. The marauders that had been found were able to be conformed, because they weren't fully radicalized by this point. The Jedi were frequently acting in the Outer Rim, under the direction of the High Council, and the golden age of the Republic continued. There was also the beginning of an initiative started by the Chancellor. He called it Starlight Beacon. It was essentially the building blocks of large communities that could unite the people of the Outer Rim. This movement had the Sith in the shadows frustrated, taking their interests elsewhere, hoping that they could undermine the consistently growing Jedi Order. While one would expect Yoda's first 2 terms to be negative, they were overwhelmingly positive for the Jedi's reputation, and he left the office without having incurred too much bad rep for the Order. When he returned to the role of lead Grand Master, full-time, the Council had much more to inform him of. Due to Yoda working as both Grand Master and Chancellor at the same time, the Council took on a lot more of his responsibilities, so that he could focus on the Republic as a whole. The High Council was able to match his outward energy with their own decisions, opening up 4 more outposts across the Mid and Outer Rim, due to their expanded budget thanks to Yoda. These territories were filled with information, but also peacekeepers, i.e., Jedi trained to fight if necessary. Yoda's influence had helped the Republic and Order become closer than ever before. Now they were inextricably connected. It was time to move forward towards a more secure future. Luckily for Yoda, he'd have a very similar-minded successor, an individual he had inspired and worked closely with throughout his administration. Also, in thanks to Republic law, they decided that, due to the 2 terms a lifetime rule, they would change it, following Yoda's administration, meaning that every 100 years, an individual would have the chance to run for the role of Chancellor again, because for most sentients, that was a lifetime. While the Jedi considered running a monopoly on leadership within the Senate, they didn't do it. Instead, that 14th seat within the High Council became a middleman or woman for the Jedi and the Republic. They had a seat within the Chancellor's cabinet, as the official representative of the Chancellor's office, and of the Jedi Council. They were elected by the current Chancellor, which meant the Republic could have eyes and ears on Jedi prospects for however long they wanted. The Jedi also had eyes and ears inside the Chancellor's office. This of course could potentially have bad ramifications, but luckily for the Jedi, the surviving Sith weren't trying to hold public office yet. Their attempts at riling up the Outer Rim into conflict were failing. Once the Starlight Beacon was launched, all potential effort put towards a Nihil or Marauder movement crumbled, and the Outer Rim slowly integrated into the Republic. There were, of course, people upset with this direction, believing that it would completely jeopardize Republic interests. But what it did do was boost the economy. It took a little longer than people wanted, but Yoda's placement at the height of the High Republic allowed an entire generation of new leadership to follow in his footsteps. Starlight Beacons were placed at 3 different quadrants in the Outer Rim, the first being on the Corellian Run, just outside of Radnor, the second on the Rima trade route, planted over Sullust, and the last was their most risky location, a place where a Republic base was situated, on the Perlimian trade route, just outside of Rango Vinda. This was a perfect middle ground between tensions with the Mandalorian Empire, which was pretty much in shambles at this point, and the vicious Hutt cartel, which ran a monopoly on Hutt space. The third beacon was the most northern placed space station in the galaxy. There was some tension with the military presence, but it also informed people of the sector of the galaxy that they were going to be protected. And thus, for the next century, including one showing of another Jedi Chancellor, the Republic would flourish. The Nihil movement would get curb-stomped by a Jedi military operation before it ever had a chance to get a head start. The public relationship with the Jedi was higher than ever before, and the Order was growing exponentially. The additional placed outposts allowed the Jedi to start orphanages, ones meant to help kids across the Outer Rim, and this also helped them ferry prospects into Jedi training grounds. It was a beautiful movement that saw prosperity on an unmatched level. Because there had been another Jedi Chancellor, there was a continuous string of positive change, but greatness can never last. People were instinctively greedy, and thus politicians started to seize opportunity over the Outer Rim. One Chancellor was found guilty of running a slave operation out of Kessel, thanks in part to their relationship with the Zagirian Empire. Another Chancellor had been using the third Starlight Beacon to smuggle spice into the core, which greatly increased their net worth. They would eventually be shot by a parent who lost a child to the spice game. The positive change that began generations before started to slip away. The Jedi tried to mediate, but lost in an election to another wealthy oligarch. It was the positivity in the air. The economy was strong, so people were okay with throwing their votes away to people who didn't care about them. Things still got done, but it just slowed down, as credits were spilled into the pockets of the Senate. By the time Yoda got his chance again, it was time for more change. At this point, the Hutts, Zygerians, and Rising Pike Consortium were the greatest threats in the galaxy. With a few more Starlight Beacons having been placed at Dakar, Bothawai, and Mygeeto in the last century, Yoda prepared to make more positive change on the galaxy. His second run at the role of Chancellor 100 years after the first wouldn't be nearly as successful as his first. He still got another 2 terms in, but the Republic had changed. It rejected some of his policies in favor of saving the budget. The High Republic, even with the help of the Jedi, was slowly fading away. Without total outright war, there was still the slow collapse of what made the Golden Age so golden. It was changing, and now the Jedi needed to find a way to maintain the status quo before things got too challenging. Unlike Yoda's first run at the role of Chancellor, his second term would be filled with violence. It wasn't by choice, but the military he helped establish saw conflict. The bases that were set up over the last century were put to good use. 2 attacks came, one from the crumbling Mandalorian Empire and the other from the Hutts. Ringo Vinda's massive Starlight Beacon was defended by the Republic, and their fleets deployed, with Jedi warriors leading the way. They wore their golden robes in the conflict, and when they emerged covered in ash and soot, they showed the galaxy who they were, what they could be if the galaxy needed them. The Mandalorians were fragile now, and they were going to become a part of the Republic. This was the darker side of Yoda's second administration. He was able to lax some of the credits that spilled into the Senate, but there was only so much he could do to stop it. Senators rejected the idea of losing out on all of their money. This was only encouraged because of how strong the Republic economy was after their expansion. If the economy could boom, then why not line their pockets? It couldn't hurt. As it turns out, it could. Yoda fixed some growing problems, and set in stone amendments that prevented businesses from gaining representation within the Senate, which was very important. Shortly before his term ended, the rapidly growing Trade Federation requested a seat after buying out members of the Senate. But the last grip on the Golden Age saved it. Those who favored their republic protected it from something that could absolutely destroy it from the inside out. And then, as it was before, Yoda's term came to an end. Much had changed for the Jedi. There were now multiple councils, and they were closing in on 15,000 members, mostly due to the variety of Starlight Beacons around the galaxy. M-count readers were at checkpoints. It was a TSA-like thing. The scan checked for weaponry, drugs, and if individuals had a high sensitivity to the Force, specifically children. And due to the popularity of the Jedi Order, many more people were willing to give their children over to it, because that was a high honor. While Yoda would never finish the conflict with the Hutt cartel during his administration, he would be a part of the final siege that resulted in the capture of Nal Hutta. Though despite all this positive change, the 100 BBY century would have the most use of the Sith plan. The growing Trade Federation had a relationship with Plagueis' master. That's why they were encouraged to join the Republic. Later down the line, towards the age of the Acolyte, Senator Rayancourt would be Plagueis' addition to the Senate, an individual who believed the Jedi had too much influence, and encouraged by a wealthy Sith to use his voice to diminish the role of the Order. It was a respected point, but the Jedi were at a point where they were untouchable as well. Those who didn't like them were considered the oligarchs, so it was kind of hard to defend their points, when it was pretty clear that these people only cared about the Jedi because it related to the money they made. Senator Rayancourt's positions would be noted by members within the Senate, but at the end of the century, they'd mostly be forgotten. With Yoda passing into his 800s, he decided to train his final student, young Dooku. It would be the joy of his late life, and he decided that after another century of waiting to become Chancellor again, he would reject the position. Instead of the High Republic coming to an end at the turn of the century, it would flow easily through the 80s and 70s and 60s. It would continue to shift, but it never directly impeded the people from the work they had done. The military was strong, but not overwhelming. The Hutts and the Mandalorians were no longer threats, and working on behalf of the Republic. Slave trade and spice rings were mostly destroyed, and thus the question remained, where was the problem? The Republic was stronger than it had ever been, yet there was decline. The economic boom, from expanding for 200 years, was slowing down, because there was no new territory to conquer. There were a total of 13 Starlight beacons, each newer than the next, and the oldest ones were retrofitted. So in a weird way, what was an overwhelming positive society felt lackluster. People feared that they weren't as good as their forefathers, due to the lack of economic growth, even though it had to eventually come to an end, which was beyond their control. There was only so much territory in the galaxy for the Republic to take and get good economic value out of. Like, for example, they weren't going to make business off of Hoth, unless snow became a commodity. All valuable territory in civilizations were mostly a part of the Republic. Issues only came from those trying to undermine what the Republic was trying to do, which mostly came from the Sith. There had been more senators with position points that were started by Senator Rayancourt, but they never lasted. Every external review thrown at the Jedi was also rejected. However, as the year crept down to 39 BBY, the Sith were finally getting their foot in the door. Where the conglomerates failed to get into the Senate, the Sith implemented a hero of the Republic military. Palpatine was a junior senator, so he wasn't ready to become Chancellor of the Republic. This was mostly due to how competitive the market for politicians had become. So Plagueis enlisted a former board member of the Trade Federation. The man worked for the Federation after serving with the Republic military on Ringo Vinda. He helped conquer the belt from Kirmia to Mon Cala, establishing control where it was needed. The man was referred to as the Sentinel, or Sentinel, a nasty kid in Nemodian who did what it took to get the job done. And he was the perfect target for the Sith, because they knew him. He had an established connection with them, because he was on the board of the Trade Federation. A lot of Sentinel's personal beliefs aligned with the Sith, and when he returned to the Corps after finishing his service, he won office easily. Per Plagueis' instructions, Sentinel ran on a pro-Jedi platform, and upon winning office, slowly retrofitted his policies to align with the Sith way. In the meantime, Master and Apprentice were out to investigate a virgins they were being drawn to. A Jedi outpost on Christophsis had picked up a child who was born of a mother with no father. Shmi Skywalker, without having been placed into slavery, was able to live freely. She adored Anakin, but after seeing some of his skills as a child, she brought him to the local outpost, where Dooku and Yoda were arriving. They were amazed at the potential, and Yoda gave his student direct responsibility over Anakin. Due to the many changes incurred over the last 2 centuries, Dooku and Yoda's relationship would be healthier than ever. There wouldn't be much tension, because the Jedi were the saviors of the galaxy. Both of them were impressed with the M-count Skywalker had, but midichlorians did not determine the output that was found in the work put into their individual training. Anakin would be brought back across the stars to Coruscant. The next several years would be much of the same thing. The Jedi were still influential, and Yoda by this point seemed relatively determined to avoid serving another term in the Senate. It had been over 140 years since his last administration. He was forfeiting his interest in the political game, until Sentinel came along. He started to weaken the Republic. The worst part is, he would have done this without Sith interference. They just heightened his platforms. Sentinel sold pieces of the Republic off to corporations, first among them being the Trade Federation. The Republic itself was in a weird space. They were absolutely in favor of the Jedi. but they had centuries worth of unprecedented peace. There wasn't anything in the galaxy that could disrupt that. That was their overconfidence. With so much economic power and presence across the galaxy, thanks in part to generations of work, something started to shift. There was complacency in place, and it didn't start with the Jedi. They were the anchor of the Republic movement, but there were those who fell out of line. The Jedi tried to stop it, but it was truthfully inevitable. Having noticed this, the Council committed an investigation into Sentinel, because these types of politicians continued to spring up, especially since Senator Raincourt, who failed multiple times to start an external review on the Jedi Order. There were people who obviously disliked the Jedi, but the biggest red flag was running on one position and slowly changing it to benefit the conglomerates, oligarchs, and be specifically anti-Jedi. These opinions by Sentinel, one presented through a different means, worked, because they had perspective on every previously failed movement. Plagueis was technically saving his best work for Palpatine, but he was still testing talking points with Sentinel, and they worked. He was able to rise to power and use his voice as Chancellor to convince people that maybe the Jedi who had been controlling the positive outcome of galactic events for centuries weren't that good. Maybe the institution established in peace wasn't what it seemed. Sentinel was delivering remarks that turned heads, and all the while, he was setting the Sith up for demise. This wasn't the same Jedi Order that Plagueis' master had, nor the one that had generations before that. This was an order that was gradually increasing their numbers every century. It was the largest sect the Order had ever seen, and the most advanced version of it. They were intertwined with every facet of the Republic, and it was the failure of the Banite lineage to make a counter earlier. Had one of the Sith Lords moved members into the Senate before Yoda's administration, they might have had a chance. But Senator Raincourt was already 150 years late on the progress made by the Jedi. The few Jedi inadequacies convinced few to listen to Sentinel, but not enough to roll back regulations on conglomerates. The amendment from Yoda's previous term couldn't be undone, and so Sentinel's own business-related motivations couldn't be fulfilled for the Trade Federation. The fully active and present Jedi Council made a move to learn where this originated. The 14th member of the Council was tasked with completing a deep dive on the potential source of these traitorous senators. It was weird, too. Many of these senators came from systems where one would least expect. Of course, for Sentinel, there was a connection to the Trade Federation, who was frequently at odds with the Jedi as is, but something wasn't adding up. Sentinel's term as Supreme Chancellor would feel never-ending for the Jedi. He frequently made them the target of scrutiny, and people even bought the bait. He'd use very rare circumstances to make them look bad, stuff that was minor, which 9 times out of 10 wasn't their fault to begin with. The tension Sentinel left behind forced Yoda from retirement, but he decided that his student would be the perfect choice. Dooku had considered it, and even lost an election in the past, but as Yoda's student, he could persevere. The election was between Dooku and Sentinel, and the bar almost swung toward Sentinel, but at the very end, Dooku was seen working with his master on another campaign. They had cut the string from the Zagirian Empire, forcing their slave operation to crumble, but they migrated to another system, and worked in secrecy, assisting their leadership by sending credits made from slaves to their throne on the home world. It was revealed during the investigation of Sentinel, and thus Yoda and Dooku went with a squad of Jedi and troopers to stop it, which they were very successful with. This was the continuous problem for the Jedi. They were always at odds with each generation of people because people forgot. History can be read over and again, but it doesn't mean anything until someone sees it, and that was the issue they continually faced. Yoda had succeeded in eras of high prosperity, but that era was changing now, though this boosted Dooku over the finish line to become the next Chancellor of the Galactic Republic. This did mean that Anakin, who was being temporarily mentored by Dooku, would always be around politics. His future master would bring him to the Executive and Senate buildings from time to time, so that he could be introduced to the lifestyle. Anakin was the chosen one, Dooku believed it, so their lineage should be the one that held the role of Chancellor. Dooku wholly believed that if Anakin would maintain the balance, it would be with control over the Republic. It would be in completing the legacy of Anakin's master's master. Thanks to the investigation going successfully, Grandmaster Yoda ventured to the Rishi Maze, where he would sneak aboard a ship with Sentinel. He used a Federation cruiser to travel. Sentinel just called it a space yacht. Yoda hoped that it wouldn't lead to anything, but during their trip through hyperspace, they stopped here in the Rishi Maze to intercept a shuttle. Jedi investigators connected multiple of these anti-Jedi senators back to two major things, the first of which being the Trade Federation, the second being Damask Holdings. So either they were in unison or there was something deeper going on here. Because this was so uncommon in their era, they had to investigate it. The Order had been cracking plots against themselves for years. Yoda especially was the target of these plots. Point being, the Order was very experienced with figuring things out before something bad happened from them. The warrior Grandmaster continued hiding along the ventilation shafts. It was pretty easy considering his size. Thanks to having served in multiple battles, skirmishes, and campaigns for the last 200 years, Yoda was thriving unlike ever before. He still didn't walk with a cane. He was locked in all the time. He listened quietly as Sentinel informed his friend that he had failed him. Their chance at dethroning the Jedi was impossible. Something else needed to be done. Plagueis claps his hands, telling his student to speak. Palpatine expressed that their targets had changed. No longer would they be working with the Federation to undermine the Jedi. The deal was off. They'd been unsuccessful for a century, and it was time to do something else. Sentinel understood, explaining that he wished to have a part in their mission. The Sith were rightfully upset. They had seen the Jedi Order continue to grow for the last 4 years. The public view of them hadn't changed much, and even worse, another Jedi was Chancellor of the Republic. Palpatine rejected Sentinel, explaining that he had failed them too many times by this point, and they also needed to move on. Yoda listened carefully, hoping for the answer to come. Sentinel pointed to Plagueis' ring, identifying its Sith origin, and explaining that if they didn't want his alliance, then he would inform the Jedi of their existence. Plagueis ignited his saber, informing Sentinel that he would perish by this day then. Sentinel then threatened the Sith again, informing the two of them that his command deck had his information, and their documents to send to the Jedi if his body fell. He recorded everything, because you never know when someone might screw you over. Yoda couldn't believe what he was hearing. Sentinel pointed down and expressed that they should have known better. They were working with the Federation for a century. Everything the Jedi needed could be revealed, and dealt with. Did they really think that they were so secretive? The Grand Master held his lightsaber and contemplated his actions. He sent a distress signal to the nearby outpost, and sent the message, Sith. If he died, then so be it. But Yoda had been in active combat throughout the last 2 centuries. He was ready for this. And if the Jedi could destroy the Sith eons before, then what would these two do to stop him from completing his destiny? The 2 Sith were trying to calm down Sentinel when a lightsaber ignited. Plagueis and Palpatine reacted, reaching for their weapons as Sentinel moved out of the way. Yoda's saber flung through the air and Palpatine moved in, deflecting the saber and jumping at the unarmed Grand Master. Yoda launched himself at Palpatine, easing past his strike and using the Force to punch and kick Palpatine. It was so fast and unexpected that the Sith apprentice was flung off of his feet and across the chambers. Yoda slammed into the ground and caught his lightsaber. He smiled. It was the same type of attack that Mace Windu would use against battle droids. Sidious looked to his master, who rolled his saber in his hands. Yoda readied himself, waiting for the obvious Lord to make a move. His blade raised, and Plagueis swung across his body with an extremely wide step. Yoda slipped it, stepping towards the Sith's body, and bashing outwards. Yoda speedily jumped away, just as Sidious struck the ground where Yoda stood. Their weapons collided, and the tiny Grand Master jumped, swung, deflected, and parried. He was so automatic with his skills, it was remarkable. The 2 Sith were beyond talented, especially in the line of Sith they had descended from, but Yoda was unstoppable. Their weapons crashed into the ground, moving into the ceiling, narrowly missing Sentinel. All the while, Yoda shuffled under their feet, jumped into the air, and used each of them as a form of defense against the other. The Grand Master didn't hold back, and avoided catching too much wind. He was using the Force as his ally, not going all out energetically. Plagueis used his hulking strength to try and crush through Yoda's defense, but the tiny Grand Master used a defensive form to lessen the physical blow from Plagueis' strike, therefore forcing the Sith Lord to use more energy. Yoda mimicked their moves, before picking on the student. Palpatine wasn't a child, but he wasn't nearly as experienced as his instructor. Yoda swung up, slashing Palpatine's thigh and spinning out of the way. He used the Force to pull Sidious's strike and jab Plagueis' foot. The Sith Lord reacted, and Yoda spun around Palpatine, deflecting strikes from the 2 sabers, and then climbing his own body, before using the Force to throw the Sith apprentice off of his feet. Palpatine tripped, and his master, not paying attention, stabbed his student through the chest. The crimson saber fell through his heart and out his back, and he dropped to the ground lifelessly. Yoda landed on the ground once more and closed his eyes, harmonizing further with the Force. Sentinel was terrified by this magnificent power. He watched Plagueis speak in tongues towards Sidious, an apology for having failed him. He then took one of his students' weapons and ignited it. Without hesitating, he cut through the ground, utilizing a sick howl as he tore across towards Yoda. He connected with the Grand Master, catching him by surprise, but Yoda adjusted, finding this fight to be a challenge, but also very rewarding. Their blades slammed together, illuminating the vessel. Battle droids had just arrived to see the display of talent and wisdom, but Sentinel stopped them from acting. He was fascinated in this. Having attempted to use the Force in his own time and failing, he hoped to learn something from watching this. He wouldn't. Yoda looked to be outmatched, based on how defensively he was playing this. Plagueis towered over him and jabbed repetitively, while swinging widely with his non-dominant hand. But the onlookers didn't realize what Yoda was doing. He was conserving energy, and finding Plagueis' weak spots. Unluckily for the Grand Master, his opponent had very little, but there was enough for him to find. Plagueis swung down, and Yoda used all of his enemy's energy to redirect the strike into his own forearm, removing it. The Sith Lord howled in anger and in pain, as Yoda switched into an aggressive assault. Plagueis defended himself as adequately as he could, but he tripped over Palpatine's body, and his eyes were consumed with a great blinding light. He wailed in agony before the cries were silenced by the Grand Master's strength. Sentinel would be arrested for attempting to fraud the Republic, and all of his assets would be used to criminalize the Trade Federation. It would be stripped and sold off to other corporations across the galaxy. Chancellor Dooku would see that it all went by smoothly. Yoda's victory would also lead to Maul being discovered by the Jedi, and eventually his two brothers, Farrell and Savage, being found as well. However, in seeing the rising darkness from the Sith and also in their power, the Grand Master elected to take some time for himself. He allowed Dooku to uphold the responsibility of the office of Chancellor. Yoda would return to Dathomir with Maul. He wished to create an alliance between the Night Sisters and the Jedi. He would spend months with the Great Mother, Talzin, and they would exchange lessons in the Force and build trust. When it was finished, Talzin suggested an outpost be brought to Dathomir. There, members of the Singing Witches clan, Night Brothers and Night Sisters, may train and work together in unison with their Jedi brothers and sisters. Yoda and Talzin had very few interactions, and this trust was more than the Sith had ever assured her. The Grand Master didn't care for the witch magic, but he was willing to be the change so that the Sith could never rise again. This youthful optimism captured the galaxy twice under Yoda's leadership, and it would be his childlike energy that would help him live beyond his 900s. But instead of finding a place within the Senate, he would guide his own lineage to maintain their honor. Dooku would be an outstanding Chancellor, and by the time his 2 terms were finished, Anakin was a young adult. The Chosen One would be instructed to conquer the darkness, but also to inspire the galaxy. He would eventually be the next Jedi Chancellor in the long line of successful leaders in Republic history. It was really cool because Yoda had started galactic expansion, and Dooku completed it. Their lineage would begin intergalactic expansion, and Skywalker's great-great-grandstudent would see it truly kicking off. Anakin's term as Chancellor eventually down the line would see the Republic uniting with the Chiss Ascendancy and assisting the unknown regions with societal growth. He would, before the end of his own 2 terms, send off the first intergalactic transports to see other galaxies. It would lead to conflict in some places, but in others, there'd be peace, unity, trade, and alliances. Anakin, in his life, would become a Grand Master and sit beside Yoda on the Council. The 2 of them would see the Jedi Order reach new heights with 45,000 members, and expanding across the cosmos. The relationship with the Witches of Dathomir expanded, and even Mother Talzin took a great liking in her friendship with the Chosen One. He would help bring the Great Mothers of Peridea back to Dathomir, something that she'd be eternally grateful for. As the lineage continued, the relationship between the Republic and the Jedi would fluctuate. This would not be bad nor toxic, as everything needs little change. Yoda's everlasting impact was the possibility of what such unity could do for the galaxy. Individuals like Sentinel would show themselves, but they'd be pushed away. Cults like the Knights of Ren would challenge the Jedi, but find themselves destroyed or becoming a part of the wider order. There was very little within the galaxy to challenge this rule. This doesn't mean that it was perfect all around, but it was the true maintaining of the Golden Age. The High Republic nearly stopped, but instead, the Age of Skywalker would see the Republic once again reaching new heights. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons: Manuel Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Alexandra Reese, the beginning and end, Jack Silver, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Smoobs, There Are Cars, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Blackie Chan, Django Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Puramark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Grandaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo Weewo 670, Annika Stink Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calic, Youngling Slayer 66, Man Manu Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Ford's Legacy Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, The 3 First Names, Darksing46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. So this is a Yoda story through and through. First things first, the duel at the end there. Yoda beats them because he's been actively fighting for 2 centuries. Not that he's doing Clone War type of combat, but he's actively fighting on the front lines. He's actively helping his Jedi survive and exceed in combat. That's why he wins there. He's just being more active, less complacent. He doesn't walk with a cane. He's doing pretty good for an 800-year-old, you know? Let him live his best life. As for the rest of the story, I really wanted to use time intervals for this. I wanted to jump around 100 years to 100 years to 100 years, so that you get the best of kind of both worlds there. You kind of get the experience, the best of the High Republic, the kind of slow down, and then like it's like a valley. You get this like little valley there where it kind of slows down, then it rises up. I think it's a very real possibility that if the Jedi had taken control over the Republic at their most pinnacle before the fight with the Nihil, then they could really just be untouchable. And that's kind of why I started in the High Republic. I think if you start this, 50 years before Phantom Menace, then you might have a much darker story. One where the Jedi kind of get sucked in. And I didn't want to start there. I started with the High Republic because I thought you'd have the most interesting opportunity for just growing. And that's what I wanted to capture there. I have another video that I plan on doing. Here's the thumbnail right here for Jedi representatives, and I'm going to do something more along those lines. So don't worry, I'm going to do something like that eventually. It's just, for this story specifically, because of Yoda's age, it just makes more sense to give him more time. Instead of, forgetting Yoda lived for a millennia, I was like, yeah, let's have 200 years of him just being the coolest guy ever, doing the coolest thing. And so this is his story. The other story will be much different. So hope you all enjoyed. I love you all. Spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.